Close to when I started playing Genshin Impact, I'd done a little bit of research about what else the company had done because, well, I tend to like to look into these things. And that's when I first learned about Honkai Impact 3rd, the previous game from the company. Figuring there would be some lore implications I could pick up on, and hearing some good things about the gameplay, I decided to try it. I briefly mentioned this before in my video about Genshin Impact being bad on mobile, that I really enjoyed the gameplay, even on mobile, but the story I felt dragged out a lot, and I'm going to elaborate more on that in this video. This is going somewhere in relation to games other than HI3, by the way, so just bear with me. The biggest problem I tended to have with the story of HI3 had to do with a sense of overstimulation from it. There were a lot of concepts being introduced that were all kind of being explained at once, which made it difficult to keep track of what was going on. Admittedly, this is something that 3rd has in one of the more extreme varieties, since we've introduced a ton of details about monsters in the world, the eponymous 3rd Impact, Valkyries, and while a lot of this is pretty interconnected, it winds up creating a massive lore dump for the player that makes what the individual concepts are and how they intersect not really stick as well as they should. When I compare it to the beginning of Genshin Impact, we start out knowing what elemental power is and being given a basic premise for how things work, but the details are explained further along when those details become more relevant to the plot. Like, we know the Abyss is evil in the first act, for example. We find out our sibling is leading the Abyss later, with indications that we'll understand later in the journey, and the relationship of the protagonist character with the Abyss gets expanded on with stories that directly relate to it. By spacing out the explanation of these things, it gives time to absorb the individual aspects, and this would work even if you were coming in now and playing all the story content back to back, because that spacing occurs in story time rather than just in real time, even if part of the consequence is that it does space itself out in real time. Meanwhile, HI3 has paragraphs of dialogue for the sole purpose of explaining backstory when we barely know anything about who we are right now. Like, all of this lore dumping is in the first probably 30 minutes of what I was playing. I'm not kidding. Of course, I found out that at some point, Honkai Star Rail's lead writer, well, okay, the narrative director was changed to the exact same writer that made this. And thus we get back to the topic that everyone likes to talk about with pretty much everything past the Jianshou Lofu. And that would be how bloated the dialogue is. It's something I cited before about Star Rail when talking about liking Penacony a lot more than Natlan. Star Rail does a lot of yapping, but it feels like the yapping matters more. I will say that I understand very well why others don't like it, but it's a very different problem than HI3, and well, not for everyone. It's probably an issue that relates more to what I want in writing than what HI3 was offering, at least by what I was seeing. Part of where a lot of people didn't like it wasn't really the exposition of new concepts like in HI3 though, but rather some of the elements I actually liked the most in the waxing philosophical aspects of it. Which, of course, brings me to how the story in Amphorius compares, which actually gets far more complaints about bloated dialogue than Penacony, with its bloat often being attributed to excessive lore dumping. And truthfully, I'm only part of the way through, and I do kind of agree. It takes a while for the game to get an understanding of what's happening, and after playing at least part of the 3.0 story, the fact that I haven't finished it will tie into one of my points later, don't worry, I think I can explain this phenomenon and elaborate for myself on how problematic to the storytelling I think it actually is. The first concept I think that delves into that is density in terms of the writing. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about how many words are being said. Density, rather, is the concept of how much weight those words hold. There's different kinds of density when it comes to dialogue as well, but let me just give a simple example. If a piece of dialogue is telling you a lot of information that you already know from a perspective that you're already aware of, then that's probably a very low density interaction. But if dialogue is coming from a new perspective and gives you information you've never heard before, then that's an interaction that's higher in most forms of story writing density. The two metrics that I was using there point to two of the types of density of dialogue that I'm talking about the most with all of this, those being emotional and informational. Generally speaking, having a higher density dialogue and moments would be better, but as brought up with my HI3 example, it is very possible to put too much in there. Let's look at how HI3 winds up steering me away from the standpoint of these types of density. The dialogue in these early chapters is packed full of informational density, but it winds up being too much for me, in part because the emotional density, at least for me, is lacking. In Penacony, part of the reason that I feel many people weren't gravitating towards that story was because the density was spread out more. There was informational density in one place, emotional density in the other, and only a few points where these fully intersected with each other. This is actually a lot of the problem with Amphorius, among other things, in that there weren't that many moments that carried both emotional resonance and information, which leads to the informational areas feeling like a lore dump and the emotionally strong areas feeling like they come too late or drag on. It's really because we had a lot less interesting stuff going on to get there. There is a third type of storytelling density with the dialogue that intersects with these that points towards why I like Penacony more, though, and that would be, well, depending on your perspective, you could refer to it as philosophical or thematic density. When talking about this aspect, though, there's really a few different ways to go about judging it, from the strength of the theme or philosophical question underlying things, or the strength of how that theme is being conveyed. So this is where I fall in love with Penacony, which has an overarching theme relating to existentialism expressed through really almost every major character in the whole story arc. Seriously, we have characters that question the meaning of their existence, we have characters who allow the viewer to question what existence really means, we have characters that want to reshape existence into what they believe it should be. Then we get to Amphorius, which doesn't seem to have as strong of a theme, and if the theming is strong, it's certainly not being strongly expressed. A couple of arguments that I could see would be purpose or destiny, but purpose is fairly weak when you put it beside Penacony, which uses purpose as a mere aspect of its theme, and destiny was, well, on top of not being expressed well, doesn't seem to quite yet be something being explored, but instead just a driving force in the plot. The other one I see, especially in the early parts of the story, is trust, but that would be a case of not really being expressed well. I hope my struggles with nailing down the philosophical theming for Amphorius communicates the way that it fails, where Penacony didn't. And to be fair, I understand Penacony being too dense for some people, and that's not calling anybody stupid either. People have different thresholds for what level of density they like in their writing, and there are people who like it more thick and expository than I do too. But I think the fact that Amphorius has a lot of things that people complain about in Penacony with less of Penacony's positives points to where people say that it's bad. But I did kind of need to start there in order to explain the balance of Amphorius's density. See, Amphorius winds up needing to explain a lot of information that would normally not need to be explained. The Pantheon, the way their gods work, etc. Once again, I do have to compare it to Penacony a little bit, because even though it did have to explain Penacony's internal politics, those still fell within the overall structure of the rest of the universe. We were being introduced to different families vying for control, but our understanding of the way that the overall setting of the game worked still applied. In Amphorius, that's not really the case, because this is a world where things that should be affecting every world just have no applicability. Hell, have you seen the shape of the damn place? The laws of physics in the rest of the universe don't seem to fully apply either. What's being introduced borders on a reset to the lore that we already had, and the result is, well, kinda the same problem you get with HI3, albeit in this case a little bit more of a self-aware problem, but not enough to really mitigate the problem properly. In fact, there are several times where we're being given a partial explanation, given a few lines of dialogue that express that it's understandable we're not getting everything, and that we just need a more in-depth explanation, only for a new explanation to come along and give us the same half measure of an explanation with different words. This happens at least twice near the beginning, by the way. Like, no joke, the first parts of the quest drag on forever because we keep being given partial explanations, and we have to set up the one straight up good scene in the first act, so we have to arbitrarily fuck up so that there's an excuse for it to happen, when that honestly could have been something Aglia did to make us earn the full explanation in the first place. All of these things combine to an issue of pacing. See, the story starts out overly expositive, but gets, at least decent later, but that decent doesn't really feel very good when you look at what you had to go through to get there, which is bloated, repetitive, and mind-numbingly expository. The exposition continues, by the way, but it's weaved in much better when you're in Castrum Chemnos than when you're casually strolling around Akima, accidentally revealing the existence of space by letting a dude hold your camera. Real plot point, by the way. And none of that compares to the story of Yarilo 6, which is probably the best section of the entire HSR story. And this is coming from the guy that thinks Penacony is fucking peak. But the fact that things move throughout Yarilo 6's story more smoothly than they do anywhere else speaks volumes for how much the pacing can make even what I'd consider a great story lesser. And even decent parts of Amphorius are just decent. And I'm willing to admit that anything I call good or great about it could very well wind up being overestimation from how this story has been talked down on before I got to it in the future. And that's like the thing about all this, right? Do I think the story so far is bad? No, not really. But do I think it's that good? At points? Unlike some people who I'm sure some of you will name, even if I don't, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that if something isn't better than their top 5 anime of all time, it's automatically shit. Because only being allowed to ever like 5 things at once sounds like a really sad existence. I thought Aglia's 4 questions was a really good scene. I felt the emotional resonance of Maide's quest for vengeance against Nicodor, and Feinen's concerns when Maide is monologuing at it, but the camera is instead focused on a surprisingly decently animated look of concern on Feinen's face. And I'm not gonna call these moments of brilliance, but there were definitely moments of sheen for me. So let's answer the question from the title of the video. Is Honkai Star Rail's dialogue overinflated? Yes. God, yes. One thing to think about, though, is the fact that I took 2 hours, having already been, I think, a couple of hours into the 3.0 story quest, and I still didn't finish, and it doesn't seem like I'm even close to the end of 3.0. Granted, the line between 3.0 story and the story after that is going to be a little bit more blurred for me, so I might be wrong on that. I know I'm definitely not finished with 3.0 because I don't have RMC yet, so I might be wrong on that. But the bigger point of contention on that is that length isn't the only indication of dialogue bloat. There's a reason I spent all this time talking about things like density and pacing, and that's because you can tell a long story while still not having that story be bloated. And that's what I personally feel happened in Penacony. Other people disagree with me, that's fine. I get that, but when talking about bloat in dialogue, there's definitely more to that answer than a word count, so making a whole video that's actually a little bit longer than most of the videos that I have been making on a weekly basis, instead of just narrowing my argument down to lots of words, too many new ones, felt like a better way to express how I felt about what was going on with the Amphoria story, and, well, also part of what took so long for me to want to get into it, too. But what do you think? Do you think Amphorius is shit? Probably. I'm not really sure if I should ask the counter question for this outro, actually, because I feel like the opinion is pretty solidly in one direction. Feel free to compare HSR to your favorite anime in the comments, and be sure to leave a like on your way out. But until next time, this is the effing Boonslayer, signing out.